Hello, I'm Brian Canfield, and today we're going to further unravel the mysteries of stained glass. And in particular, in this episode, we're going to continue on with the restoration process. If you recall, we took out a window, the St. Michael window at Camp Pendleton at the ranch house, and now that we've extracted it from the site, we've brought it back to Barrow Stained Glass in the studios, and we're going to continue with the technical aspect of the restoration. And if you remember, what some of the problems were with that window is not only did it have broken and shattered pieces, which we have to address, but it also had that bulging. So the first thing you have to do once you get the piece back, the artifact back to the studio space, we have to lay it out onto a flat surface. And if you recall, that bulging is where you had the vertical surface, it started to move out. And here's an example of what really bad bulging is. Over time, windows can really start to move even more than 1.5 inches off plane. And what that does is over time, it can start breaking those pieces. So that's the first thing you have to address. And to address that, you can't necessarily push those pieces back in place, because lead, being malleable, once it's stretched, it will not go back. And so what you have to do is allow gravity to bring that piece back into a flat plane. And so what that entails is laying it out on a flat surface like it's been, and we undid the rebar, which is that cold pressed 1/8 inch, 1/2 inch steel, this one in particular, that was soldered onto the surface, and that helps with the bulging, but it also keeps it from going back in place once it does start to bulge. So we took off the rebar, which is incredibly tedious for this particular project. It's been sitting for literally almost 3 months, and now it's flattened out. And with a historic piece such as this one, it came out of a residence, or more so the ranch house, that was historically nominated. Now what that means is there's a certain level of standards that you have to adhere to when working on any artifact out of a nominated structure. And when it comes to nominations, you can have national, you can have a state historically nominated site, and you can also have a local site. This one, I believe, is on the state level. But nonetheless, the standards are dictated typically on the federal level through the Secretary of Interior Standards. Now, not to get into all the technical aspects of that, fundamentally it's like this. If you have a structure, let's say from 1920, a 1920s bungalow that was nominated historic, you wouldn't have someone come in and replace the window sashes that were originally wood and some old school, clear glass. You wouldn't replace that with vinyl, right? That's what the standards are about. So when addressing these artifacts, you can't go in and replace and repair these with just modern day materials per se. You have to replace and repair with both in-kind materials and also in-kind techniques. And so this window being from the 40s, that's not that old, but you wouldn't come in and put in some contemporary pieces because it ruins the authenticity of the artifact. And so now that it's flattened out, the next thing that we do is, it's almost like documenting archaeological finds. You have to document things, you have to make rubbings, and also take meticulous notes of what you're doing, and also do a visual diary as you go along in the process of what you're doing to the piece. But a rubbing is really going to be the blueprint, the original form of the window. And how we typically do that is we'll take a plain piece of butcher paper, put it on the window itself, tape it down, and then you maybe have seen this with other uses, maybe mosaics and different rubbings of stone. It's very similar in that you take something that's going to transfer the lead lines, in particular with stained glass, onto the paper. So as I go through and I start to rub, literally, hence the name of rubbing, over the top of the glass, you see that the lead lines, the high points of the lead, start to come through. And once we do that to the entire window, we then have a true rubbing, which if we look over here on what's on the table, this is actually the lead lines, and this also dictates, the shape of the glass, where that glass is going to go. So then when we start to address what needs to be repaired and restored, we have an original guideline in which to number and place those pieces as we go through that process. So now that we have our rubbing, the next thing we need to do is assess, meticulously assess what needs to happen. And when it comes to cracks and breaks, what I like to do is I just go in and I put a little piece of tape down, and it shows me things that I need to really look deeper into and analyze as to what process I need to employ. When I start looking at some of these individual pieces, sometimes you find a piece that will just have what we call a crack, a single crack. Now, the acceptable practice in restoring stained glass is that you would go in and just put in a lead line, and trying to put in something that's not going to take away from the aesthetic value of the piece, but it's also going to bring that piece back to life so that it doesn't further crack. And so putting in lead in between a single crack, that's completely acceptable. And when you look at restored pieces, they have these arbitrary lead lines here and there. Well, that's what took place. You want to keep as much original material as possible. But that's just with a single crack. If we have a piece that is shattered, now that really compromises the aesthetic value of the entire piece when you have a shattered single piece. Now this one shattered into approximately 6 pieces. Now if I went in and put in lead, it would just take away from that individual piece greatly, because you'd have just a bunch of black lines everywhere. So that's where we come in and we decide, well, we need to replace that with in-kind material and also in-kind technique. And this is a heavily painted piece. So then not only do we have to replace the glass color appropriately, and this happens to be hand-blown antique glass, so here's the replacement piece. Now I need to come in and I will be painting, and we discussed that in some earlier episodes. That's where we apply the pigment, we fire it in the kiln, and then it permanently fuses that pigment onto the glass, and then we go back and replace where the broken, shattered piece was. Now, in restoration of stained glass and painting, me as an artist, I have my own individual artistic expression every time I put down a paint stroke. And now that's the same with any painter out there. So I can't necessarily go in and completely duplicate exactly what was on that original piece from that original artist. It's accepted that I would come in and try to do my best and to duplicate what was there, but it's almost like you don't want to duplicate it exact so someone wouldn't be able to identify it, because it's almost like you're doing a forgery, and you want the history of the piece to be evident. So going in and seeing those differences is just a part of the historicity of that piece, and you would be able to identify that it has been restored, and that's very important because that is the history of the piece. So if you can see here, just in this particular area, it's not like I can just go in and grab this piece of glass and take it out. I have to address, how do I get that piece out? And typically, it seems like a lot, but typically you would have to literally extract this entire upper quadrant just to get to that one piece. And that is what you have to do sometimes. Yes, there are other circumstances where you might not have to do that, but that is the accepted practice. You extract this entire panel, get that piece out, replace it, and then put it back in and resolder everything. So that is the restoration process. It's very meticulous. It takes a long time, but really what I'm doing is bringing this back to life, because it's going to last at least another 80 to 100 years before maybe these issues might have to be readdressed again. So every project is different, and I have a few more restoration projects in the studio that we can discuss in regards to some of the other approaches that you can do. So I have a few more projects up on the easel to look at and discuss some of the things that we talked about on the St. Michael project. And fundamentally, it's the same issues that you have to consider. The original state of the window, is it bulging? For example, this one you can see that there's quite undulations within the plane of the glass. So of course that would have to be addressed. Missing pieces, broken pieces, just cracks versus the shattered pieces. All of those issues still stand. For example, the Christ window here, this was done by Fred Wieland, a incredibly talented San Diego stained glass artist. He was very prolific and did a lot of work in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. This window in particular was done for the Naval Chapel down by Balboa Park in San Diego, and this is now a Veterans Memorial Center or museum. And I've extracted these pieces, and we have the cracks then to address, which you can see a very large crack right here. And as far as restoration, you have to ask, if I put in a lead line, will that compromise the authenticity of the piece? Will it take away from the aesthetic value of the piece? And is that an acceptable method of restoration? And this particular one, I would say, let's put in a lead line. Because to recreate this, I more than likely would be able to match the glass, because this is actually Kokomo opalescent glass. How do I know that? Well, you just know by analyzing it and knowing the different manufacturers' trademark kind of details in their glass. And we've identified then it's Kokomo opalescent. They've been around since 1880 thereof, so it definitely can get that glass, even though this was done in the 40s. But again, to recreate that painting, that's not that difficult, but I would prefer to keep this authentic. And if you look over here in this area, we've already have some restoration done. And if you look at that, that's a lead line that was put in when these two pieces cracked. And you'll see a lot of windows like that, and that is an appropriate way to restore. Yes, it's somewhat of an eyesore, but it's authentic. That's the original material, which to me is more important. Now let's imagine down here in Christ's face, there's a large crack. Now there is a crack in the face, but it's more in his hairline right here, which again, I'm going to put in a lead line. But imagine if there was a crack going through his face. That's where you're kind of on the fence, and you ask yourself, well, should I repair and replace his face, which is the hallmark of that particular window? Or do I just put a big old lead line that goes through his face? Fortunately, we don't have that issue to contend with. So to get to this piece, I'm going to have to extract this entire portion, pull that out, put in some lead, and then replace everything as is original as possible. This particular window is almost a whole different level of consideration because of its age. We recently got this in the studio from an antique dealer in Solana Beach, and he found this at an estate, and I'm not even going to tell you how much he bought it for. It was an absurdly low price. And he brought it in, and it's exciting to see something this old, because in the United States, being such a young country relative to the world, having a 200-year-old, 200-plus-year-old church or stained glass piece, that seems old, but that's nothing compared to Europe. So we don't get a lot of old stained glass in especially the West Coast, because even having a 100-year stained glass is considered old out here. But looking at this initially, I thought this could be 400- or 500-year-old piece of stained glass. And just real quick, what makes me think that is, one, if we think back to some of the art history and different genres and techniques in stained glass, we look at the faces. This is very much grotesque, almost primitive in that its use of line, and it's done very well. But it could be medieval, because if you look at the type of line use and the lack of shading, that would indicate that it's pre-Renaissance even. Now this could have been made contemporary in times, but that type of style would be definitely pre-Renaissance. And looking around the type of glass, the colors used, Can also give hints to where it came from, either France or England even. But most importantly, what indicates the age of this window, and I think it's been re-leaded once, but what really indicates the age of the window is looking at some of the glass on the perimeter. You're going to see what's called pitting. And this side was actually, typically the painted side was towards the inside of wherever it was installed. This is the interior facing plane. But if I turn this around and we'll look at the pieces up close, you're going to see what's called pitting. And it's literally like the glass has been ground out by weathering and the pollution and acid rain and things of that nature. Long exposure to the weather. And so this is a whole nother level of restoration, but again, it's primarily the same principles that you adhere to as far as the standards of what you would do. So that's the restoration process. We're going to get St. Michael back together, looking new, feeling good structurally. We're going to get it back into Camp Pendleton so the public can begin viewing it once again. And I hope that you really enjoyed the restoration part of stained glass, because as time goes on, it's going to become more and more popular in the United States, and it has to be done in the appropriate way. I hope to see you again. Thank you.